In this video, I'd like to walk students through the fourth rule in lesson 3 as we work through the accidents of the parts of speech. So far, we've looked at numerus or number, casus, case, genus, gender, and now we're going to look at declinatio or declension in rule number 4. So let's just jump right into this and look at the Latin and get a translation going. Declinationes sive forme nominum sunt quinque. Declinationes is the plural form of declinatio. Declinatio, declension singular. Declinationes is plural, declensions. Declinationes sive forme nominum. The declensions or forms nominum of nouns sunt quinque are 5 in number. Quinque is the Latin for 5. The declensions or forms of nouns are 5 in number. There are 5 declensions of nouns. Prima, cuius genitivus singularis terminator in ai diphthongo, ut musa, muse. The first declension, prima, or declinatio prima, first declension, cuius means whose, genitivus singularis, whose genitive singular form. So, if we have a noun and we find the genitive case form of that noun in the singular number, the genitive singular, it will end in the diphthong a, I, right? That's how we identify nouns of the first declension. I know this is information you're not really going to understand until we get into the study of nouns and declensions, but I want you to just learn what's in the text, memorize the rules, because they're going to help you in the next lessons, okay? The declensions or forms of nouns are 5. The first declension, the genitive singular is terminated in AE diphthong, in the diphthong AE, and there's an example, musa. The noun musa, if we look at the genitive singular form of the noun musa, we'll see that it ends in the diphthong AE or AE, all right? That's how we identify the first declension. So if we take all the nouns, we can divide them up into families. And the way that we divide them into families is based on their declensions. The way that we identify the declensions of different nouns is by looking at the genitive singular ending for each noun. That's how we know which family it belongs to. For the first declension, if the genitive singular form ends in the diphthong AE, then it's first declension. All right? Secunda, the second declension. Cuius genitivus terminator littera E. The second declension, whose genitive singular terminator is ended with the littera E, with the letter I, or E in Latin. Ut dominus domini, such as dominus, domini. Dominus means Lord, it's the nominative form, but if we look at the genitive singular form, we find that it ends with the letter I, or E in Latin. The ending of E tells us that dominus is a noun that belongs to the second declension. So we have the first declension, where the genitive singular ends in AE, and now we have the second declension, where the genitive singular ends in the letter I. The third declension, tertia, cuius genitivus terminator syllaba is, ut sermo, sermonis. The third declension, whose genitive singular ending ends, or the genitive singular form ends with the syllable is. If the noun has is at the end of its genitive singular form, then it's a noun of the third declension. For example, sermo, sermonis. Sermo means speech, If we look at the genitive form of sermo, we find sermonis. It ends in the syllable is. That tells us that sermo is a third declension noun. Next, the fourth declension, cuius genitivus terminator syllaba us. The fourth declension, the genitive singular form ends with the syllable us. If we see us at the end of the genitive singular form for a noun, then we know it's a fourth declension noun. One example here, sensus. Sensus is the genitive singular form. It ends in us. That tells us that sensus is a fourth declension noun. And then lastly, quinta, fifth, the fifth declension, cuius genitivus terminator litteris e et I separatis, ut dies, diei. The fifth declension, the genitive singular form ends in ei. If we see a noun whose genitive singular form ends in ei, we know that noun belongs to the fifth declension. It says there, e et I separatis, to tell us that this is not a diphthong. It's the letter E and I form two separate syllables. So, for example, dies, we should not say die, as if it's two syllables. We should say di, e, I, because that e and I are separatis, they're separate. Okay? We look at dies, we see the genitive singular form is diei, and we know that dies belongs to the fifth declension. So, what we learn there, declinationes nominum sunt quinque. The declensions of nouns are 5. Their names are very simple. It's just first, second, third, fourth, fifth. The 5 noun declensions. What they tell us is what noun belongs to what family based on the ending of its genitive singular form. If the genitive singular ends in the diphthong ae, then it belongs to the first declension. If the genitive singular ending is in I, then it belongs to the second declension. If it's in the syllable is, it belongs to the third declension. If it's in the syllable us, then it's fourth declension. And if it ends in the two vowels e and I, then it's fifth declension. Now, why do we need to know that? Because when we learn that we're going to memorize all of the forms for each of the 5 declensions. So we'll know all the first declension forms, all the second declension forms, all the third declension forms, all the fourth declension, and all the fifth declension forms. We'll memorize just one example of the first declension. And why it's important is because if you come across a new word, a new noun, once you can identify that it belongs to the first declension, then you know all of its endings because it's just like the other first declension noun. So instead of memorizing all the forms of every single noun, we're just going to memorize an example from the first declension, an example from the second declension, and so on for the third, fourth, and fifth declensions. And then as soon as you can identify that a noun belongs to a declension, you automatically know all of its endings, all of its forms. So it saves you a great amount of time when you memorize the declensions and then simply determine what declension each noun belongs to. You can figure out all of its forms and translate its meaning based on those forms. But all you need to do is know the declension. So we learned that there are 5 declensions. So here, for declinatio. Declinatio is the 4th accident. There are 5 different declensions for nouns. First, second, third, fourth, fifth. And you need to know how they're identified by the different genitive singular endings. The rule goes on, however, to say, pronomina meus, tuus, suus, noster, et vester, ad primam et secundam nominum declinationem spectant. What that means is the pronouns meus, tuus, suus, noster, and vester. These pronouns follow, spectant, follow the first and second declension of nouns. So they take their forms, these pronouns, they simply use the first and second declension forms. And we'll study that when we study pronouns. And then it says, nostras, vestras, ad tertiam. That means the pronouns nostras and vestras, which we'll study later, they follow the third declension forms. Cetera proprias habent formas. Cetera, the rest, proprias formas, their own declensions, their own forms, habent, have. So there we learn that once we learn the 5 noun declensions, it also helps us to know the forms of the pronouns, because the pronouns follow the noun declensions. And then lastly, participia que in ans et ens exeunt, participles which end in the syllables ans, A-N-S, et ens, E-N-S, participles which end in ans et ens, ad tertiam declinationem pertinent. So participles also, when the participles end in ans et ens, and we'll understand what that means later, when we find that a participle ends in ans or ens, then we know that it follows the forms of the third declension of nouns. And they give an example, amans, which means loving, and docens, which means teaching. Reliqua, the rest of the participles, reliqua, ad primam et secundam, to the first and second declensions pertain. Ut amaturus, amatura, amaturum, amandus, amanda, amandum. Now, participles, I've said before, if you've been paying attention to the videos, participles are like adjectives. And it's no surprise then that we find amaturus, amatura, amaturum can be any of the 3 genders because it works like an adjective. Amaturus is masculine, amatura is feminine, amaturum is neuter. Those forms of the participles follow the first and second declension noun endings. Amaturus is formed like dominus. Okay? Amatura is formed like musa. And amaturum will be formed like a second declension neuter noun, which we'll learn about. So when we learn the 5 noun declensions and the forms of the 5 noun declensions, not only do we know the forms of all of the nouns, but we also will know the forms of the pronouns and of the participles. Okay? So we don't need to learn lots of different declensions when we get to different parts of speech. They use the noun declensions. So again, the goal of our study in grammar, remember, is to use wisdom to figure out the most efficient way to learn all of the words and all of the meanings, and all the different ways we can communicate in our language. And what we're learning here is, by learning the 5 noun declensions, we can learn all of the forms necessary for not only nouns, but also pronouns and participles. Okay? And again, you're just getting started. This is all new. I'm sure you feel overwhelmed as you get into these studies, but that's just normal when you're getting started. We're going to go through all of these things in detail for the rest of this whole course. All that you need to know as we go through this, remember, there are certain things which accompany the parts of speech, such as number, case, gender, declension, conjugation, mood, tense, person, figure, and species, which are called the accidents or attributes of the parts of speech. That's the focus of lesson 3. So far we've looked at the 2 different numbers, singular and plural. We've looked at the 6 different cases, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative, and ablative. We've looked at the different genders, the 3 principal genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. then common of 2, common of 3, epicene, and doubtful. And now we've looked at the 5 noun declensions. And we also see that those 5 noun declensions help us with pronouns and participles. So we're just going through learning about the different accidents because we're going to be using these words and talking about these things as we get started in studying the parts of speech in our next lesson. So you should know what the 2 numbers are, what the 6 cases are, what the genders are, and now what the 5 declensions are. Okay, the 5 noun declensions and how they're identified by the different genitive singular endings. The best way to learn, as I always say, is to memorize, memorize, memorize. You don't understand all these things, it would be a waste of time for me to explain all these things in detail because we're going to go through all of them for the rest of this course. Memorize these rules, and as we move on, this memory of these rules is going to become very helpful for you in the future. So memorize the Latin, know its translation, and just keep developing your overall understanding of the accidents of the parts of speech. I hope that was helpful to get through Rule 4 in Lesson 3. You have a lot of study to do. As I said, this is a long lesson that requires a lot of study, and when you get finished up with studying Rule 4, I'll be waiting for you with another video to help you through Rule number 5. If you have any questions, contact me. I'm always here to help. God bless your studies.